we have a guest with us from Indiana who's going to talk to us about a topic that I think gets left behind a lot, and it's important to people, and that is spirituality and how we support people with disabilities to practice the spirituality and religion of their choice. And I want to thank Madeline Webster, who's here with me today, for introducing us to Sarah McKenney, who's going to be our speaker about that issue today. Madeline used to work with Sarah in Indiana, so she's going to hang on here in case I need some extra support. Sarah, we're really glad you're here today. Can you start off by telling people a little bit about who you are and your journey with combining your interest in spirituality and disability?
Absolutely. I guess it started a little personal. I was diagnosed when I was little with MR, mental retardation, and later was realized that wasn't the diagnosis that was most accurate, but that I'm dyslexic. And so my own journey through special education and through fighting for my own education rights and in figuring out how my brain works. I also got to know a lot of interesting people along the way. And so I think at an early age, I connected with a lot of people with disabilities and the wide variety that means. And then I will also say both my parents are chaplains, so I kind of followed in the family business, so to speak. And I just realized over the years that my friends were often left out in their places of worship, told that they, and sometimes told that they just blatantly were not welcome, or that they were misunderstood. And my friends would, it was the assumption that they didn't have a spirituality or couldn't have spiritual wants or needs or beliefs. And so that opened up a desire to try and change that and open one, more access, but also the benefits from both sides. So that's kind of the short end of that journey.
So interesting to me. And I really want you to share what your job is, because it frankly never occurred to me that there might be a role at an ARC that actually was dedicated to spirituality. Can you tell me about that and how it came to be?
So my title is Spiritual Support and Volunteer Coordinator. And it could be explained as a chaplain. The biggest difference between me and like a hospital chaplain is a hospital chaplain is going to try and make sure that the spiritual needs of the patients in that hospital are being met, and by the chaplain. I'm more of like a spiritual case manager where I am not meeting the needs. I am connecting people to people in the community, to faith communities, to spiritual practices, so that those needs can be met in cooperation with the community versus just between me and them. So that's kind of the easiest way to kind of describe that. And then I do a lot of cooperative teaching, training, and such too with congregations. And we'll be starting a program in the spring that will basically be mentoring 5 congregations on how they can step-by-step be more inclusive. There is a little snippet of some of the things that I am involved in and the degrees and all that I have. But I will point out the other aspect to the spiritual support program is we use, and I didn't actually put it here, but we use a definition of spirituality that talks about that really is referencing core values of belonging, feeling valued, feeling worth, feeling loved. And now how those spiritual needs are met are then going to be different for each person, whether it's spiritual practices, whether it's connection and relationships, whether it's nature, whether it's a specific faith tradition, whatever that might be. that is kind of the definition of spirituality that we work with. So we are secular and then for support people of various spiritual and religious practices. So why include people with disabilities in your congregation or in your faith tradition or spiritual practice? Inclusion leads to belonging. Inclusion is not the same as belonging. Inclusion is still kind of ableistic in a sense that it is a group of people who are choosing to include another group of people. So there's still that decisiveness of I am choosing to open the doors to you or welcome you. Whereas belonging, everyone is equal, everybody's voices and gifts are being shared. So belonging is more than being included in something. I would argue it's a basic human need because it means you are loved just as you are. You have value and worth just as you are. And we are not deciding that it's okay for you to be here. You yourself are valued just as you are. And that, so it's mutually beneficial. It's mutually beneficial to have people with disabilities in your congregation. People with disabilities present, active, and sharing their gifts is not one-sided. Often congregations view including people with disabilities as an act of service. I am allowing you to be here and offering my service to you. But people with disabilities having their own gifts to share and the congregation benefiting from those gifts is what the aim is. And then I'll also add, the more we get to know one another, the more we get to know one another and who God or creator or a higher power created our neighbor to be and to use their gifts and what our neighbor has to teach me, assuming I don't know everything. That all helps us learn more than about our God, our creator, our higher power. So again, you see the mutuality, but you also see the spiritual benefit as well. So here I have, just to kind of start, and I know we're heading kind of already into resource territory, but I did want to talk about maybe some helpful tips on how you can start conversations in your own congregation or spiritual practice. I will admit these resources are more geared toward like specific faith traditions or congregations versus like a yoga studio offering the spiritual practice of yoga. You could definitely take these and then create your own. So please feel free to do that. If this doesn't quite fit your niche, your faith tradition or spirituality niche, please take and use and change to what fits you. So we do have Stone Belt's indicators of belonging. That is a great, it's a pretty big survey, but it's a congregational survey that doesn't just look at physical access. And it's a great survey of not looking at all the things that you're doing wrong or bad, but as a way to really reflect on all the different elements of what it takes to actually reach belonging. And then it actually has at the end, a way to take that assessment and that information and move it into a strategic plan that is a doable plan instead of just looking at this major project of, oh my gosh, look at all the things that we need to fix. Coming up with 3 to 5 things that you want to focus in on and hone in on first. And then the last thing I would suggest is in your congregation, create a disability inclusion committee or committee on belonging. And it really must include at least one person with a disability, and or parents of persons with disabilities, but having people with disabilities voices themselves is even more critical than parents, as even a parent's view is going to be different from the individual. So those are two kind of initial suggestions. And then I also have several other resources on Facebook, if that's your thing. I suggest going to the Institute on Theology and Disability page. That is going to be that's kind of their formal page where they're offering lots of resources. And then their group where you can really openly ask questions and people will give you resources, articles, books, PDFs, worksheets, ideas. I still use that quite heavily. And then also the Special Needs and Disability Ministry Leaders Forum, which you can use in the same way. If you are a conference person, especially as we start breaking out of our homes and starting to do more stuff in person, there are two conferences that those are the kind of top two conferences that I'd highly suggest. And I personally go to the Institute on Theology and Disability. Both are multi-faith or interfaith conferences. So there is representation of a variety of faiths. And it's actually the Institute on Theology and Disability is actually, even though we meet here in the US, it is turning into a global movement and conference. Oh, and I will also say on that conference and on both conferences, but I'll speak mainly to the Institute because that's the one that I've been to the most. When I've gone, there's been between 100 and 200 people from a variety of different countries, and over 50% of the people themselves have disabilities. And I will also say it's filled with theologians, ministers, rabbis, all who have different disabilities. So that in and of itself is very empowering, especially if you are a person with a disability, to see not just non-disabled people in the profession, but actually people with disabilities in leadership positions. It really is encouraging to see your fellow people with disabilities in leadership. And then there are some webinar sites. We have just started our own webinars. We've produced about 5 for this last year and will continue in the coming years. Collaborative on Faith and Disability also has a large webinar library. And then these are a few practical books that I would recommend, and that I will actually the belonging toolkit came from including people with disabilities in faith communities by Eric Carter. And so he actually has in his book different forms that you and your congregation can use. So you can really just kind of print off and use the forms. And actually same goes from longing to belonging. And the Autism and Your Church by Barbara Newman. All of them are very practical tools.
All right, we've got a bunch of questions. I do want to start with a clarifying question from your presentation, because yes. I love all the resources and tools that you've got for congregational work. If I'm a family member of a person with a disability, or a person with a disability that just feels like my church could do better, what do you recommend as kind of a starting point to try and engage spiritual leadership in those conversations?
I mean, you can hand people books and say, please read this. But also having I would start by having just an honest conversation, and starting with a conversation of of maybe some myth busters, which are that people with disabilities do have spiritual needs, no matter what their disability is, and I'll argue that to the T. And so having that conversation and then saying, I want, this is what I want, and I'm willing to help this congregation then get there. Um, I've also noticed, with every critique, I'm more than happy to help to offer a solution and be a part of the solution. As I know from clergy, that can be very overwhelming to hear another thing that you've got to do for your congregation. And we don't want it to be a burden. We want it to be something that they are very interested in and see the value of.
We have a lot of questions sort of about the case management side of spirituality. So I'm gonna tackle some of them and then move forward. So with people that are trying to explore what spirituality means for them and where they want to go out to engage in a community, are there questions that you ask to help kind of figure out where they might feel like they find a good fit?
I will also say I am part of my training is also as a chaplain. So I am very aware of leading questions. And so I am very mindful the moment a person is wanting to have a conversation with me. I am very constantly aware of my own background, and then the questions that I'm asking in an attempt to not lead or make any assumptions. I usually start with a person's background. For most of the people that I work with, they're adults. So I will start by saying that. So usually I start with a conversation of maybe what did they do as a kid? How did they grow up? To maybe understand some of the traditions or things that are most familiar, at least historically. And then quite frankly, I dive right into the hard topics. And again, this all depends on the person's needs and abilities for communication. But for the most part, I dive right down into some of the hard topics and ask theological questions of what do they believe, what don't they believe. If I do know that they're Christian, I'll ask, quite frankly, are you okay with a female being your pastor or a male being a pastor? While these are kind of concrete things that don't necessarily go beyond deep into theology, they at least give me hints as to what tradition we're kind of working on. Because again, when you're looking at people of all different faiths, having some of those factors help. And so if they say, no, I don't think women should be clergy, I say, okay. So now the scale's getting a little smaller as to where I think they're at least familiar and arrive at. And then I start really asking some of those other tough questions. And sometimes we go off and really realize they don't believe at all what their parents believe. And so then we have some fun with exploring what else is out there.
That actually leads into a couple of other questions we've gotten from families that are not religious, and their child's expressing an interest in God. And I don't know age of child, but how would you guide somebody to explore what faith might mean to them if they're not coming from a faith background?
I also say trying is huge. So while I might, and I've got a few people that I have books that are like, what is a book? What is paganism? What is Judaism? And we go through some books to kind of just learn about different faith traditions and what kind of connects to them. But then also we will take and we will go and try different congregations to see what connects with them the most. And even if somebody does come from a specific faith tradition, I always encourage people to try 3 different places at minimum, even if they love the first one, I encourage them to try the other two, because this is a great opportunity for learning, and not just, again, getting the answer that the person in front of me is trying to tell me, but really exploring what I like and what I want. So, I mean, for some, I do over a whole bunch of sessions, because we're going to be learning about different faith traditions. And then they tell me what they like and what they don't like. And then that kind of gives me keys of, ooh, I think you might like this faith tradition, because that you really liked this aspect of what we talked about here. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's really an open conversation.
Got a question about any tips for explaining to family that my son's disability is not a result of our family's lack of religious practice. And this gets into a little bit of our conversation before we started about this connection between theology and disability, and how they kind of intertwine.
And it's a tough question. And it's a tough area. I think there is a history, especially if within the Christian tradition, partly due to what Christians call kind of the healing narratives, and maybe I would say misusing those narratives to and the connection to disability and sinfulness, or disability and lack of faith. And there definitely is something there. I hate to offer more books, but I am going to offer an amazing book, actually written by a friend of mine, that talks about this issue, but does a great job of unpacking. The title is Disability and the Way of Jesus. So again, this is a Christian resource, so I will say that. And it's holistic healing in the Gospels and the church. And it's by Bethany McKenney Fox. And she does a great job of specifically unpacking those healing narratives and drawing our attention to some of those other areas in those stories. But then also unpacks the hurt of the disability community, with this understanding of disability linked to how strong one's faith is, or sinfulness. And I would also remind your pastor that if they're going scripturally, Christian scripture, we were made in the image of God. So if we were made in the image of God, would God create anything that wasn't meant to be imperfect?
We did have a personal question, Sarah, about whether you felt like when you were younger and identified with a disability, did you feel like you weren't included, that you didn't belong in your home church?
Yes and no. No, I was not included with my peers, and that was in part due to negativity received by the teachers. So open open negativity received by the teachers. So teachers calling me stupid, unintelligent, bothersome to them. I was a burden. That kind of became right in front of other children. So, that became the gateway of other children thinking very negatively about me as well. And so that fed, of course, into the group of kids that I was with in my youth group, because they knew me from school. And so I never really fit in with the other children. I fit in with all the older folks in my church, and that was kind of my place. But the place that I really felt that I belonged, and kind of the image of belonging that I held through my faith story, was camp. that was away from my hometown. Nobody knew me, and I could have a fresh start every time I went to camp. And camp is kind of just magical in that sense of that's kind of the goal of camp, is people to come and from all over and belong for that week. And so that, and then nature was where was how I connected the most. Home church was rough. I have a good relationship with them, but with the kids, it was rough.
The last question that I want to cover here, actually two questions, is talking about advocating with group home staff. So how do you work with the staff to help people find the church of the person's choice versus what's convenient for the majority of the people in the home? Or, you know, it's down the street from us, so let's make this work for everybody.
First of all, this question speaks directly to my heart and is actually a part of what my doctoral thesis is touching on, which overall is transportation. And before you talk about any of this belonging stuff, getting people to the place of their choice is the number one barrier, especially when you're dealing with staff because of staff shortages, because of staff's own beliefs, even though it's their job. Some places are not as welcoming. And so staff sometimes feel awkward going to a place that's not of their own tradition. And so it gets messy real quick. So I would say initially it's kind of a two answer. One, trying to work with the group home of sometimes asking what is their staff ratio like on Sundays or Fridays or Saturdays or Wednesdays or whatever day you're talking about. Because some of what you're going to be working against is the staff shortage. So if Sunday is just overbooked and not possible, I'd also look at what other options are there. Is there Torah studies or religious education classes or fellowship opportunities? Yeah, I know that's not worship, but it's other congregational activities that might be easier for that person to get to other than everybody trying for Sundays. The other thing is encouraging that congregation to help with transportation. And asking the company, what do I need to sign off on? So one of the things that I do is a lot of our folks, we try and not rely on staff. So I reach out to congregations, figure out who is willing to help with transportation. They become a volunteer. So we have a little bit of training. They sign paperwork and all that liability stuff. And then they can help with transportation. So then that takes the weight off of staff. So that's kind of the twofold answer, working in both directions.
Well, and I have to say, we've got a few more questions that have come up around this issue. I think that it's the responsibility of the organization to really set expectations and educate staff about what they are to do in community settings, including faith communities. And, you know, one of the things that we talk to employees about is, you know, that they have to leave their own values at the door, and they're going to go support somebody because that's their religious experience, their spiritual experience, not the employees. So that's kind of a bottom line foundational learning that staff get from the beginning of the time they walk in the door here.
There is a form in here that I have congregations who work with me. I encourage almost every congregation that works with me to actually, you can use this for people with and without disabilities, children and adults. And it's a form, it's basically an intake form. What are your gifts? What are your challenges? How can we support you? What are your interests? And then there's a little, I mean, it's only like a couple pages. And then the back is basically a support plan if there needs to be a support plan. And you don't even have to hand this just to the people with disabilities in your congregation. You could hand this out to everyone, because you never know who's going to walk in the door, who needs some support. And so churches who have, or congregations who have like welcome tables, you could put the form there. You could have it mailed out to everybody every year. Or maybe the congregation doesn't have this. Maybe you are a family member and or a DSP, and you want to take this, print it out, and hand it to the congregation and say, this is what their interests are. And this is ways that you can support them in following through with their interest.
We did have a question about, well, should I be looking for a church with a special needs ministry, or is it better to be in an inclusive church? And I think that everybody's probably got a little bit different. Again, that's about what that person's individual experience is. So what is would you like to say something short about that, Sarah?
I am an advocate for inclusion. And that is that disability specific ministries can be wonderful, but again, it's assuming all people with disabilities have the same type of interests or needs. And again, it's other people the risk you get is other people deciding what the disability, the special needs ministry needs. Versus it being full inclusion and belonging of people can choose what they want and what they don't want, and take from an adult ed class whatever they need. They may not understand 100% of it, but they may get 1%, and that was fantastic for that day. You get pluses and minuses of both, but I tend to promote full inclusion programs.
So I'm going to wrap up here. Madeline, you've been remarkably quiet. So I'm going to just ask you to give us any final thoughts you've got about our conversation today, and then we'll wrap up with Sarah with your final thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when Sarah and I were talking about doing this, we ended up talking for like 2 hours or something. And we were talking about gifts, and sometimes in a choir, gifts is not reading music perfectly. It's joy. It's getting everybody excited. It's making people happy they're there. And I think that there are so many gifts that we overlook because we're so focused on, well, if they can't read the liturgy, or if they can't. And that's one of the things that I love about Sarah, and why I wanted to invite her, is because I think that she's really good at recognizing the multitude of ways that somebody can give. So I'm just so glad we got to do this today.
I just want to say thank you all for the invitation. What a wonderful way to I love the fact that you all asked so many questions, and that the interest was alive. So again, thank you for the opportunity to chat.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Madeline. This has been really fun. Bye.